killed in the wreck. It was the fall of 1996, a night etched into my memory like a scar. It was one of those rainy nights where the sky seemed angry and the world felt heavier. The storm had been raging for hours, and the roads were slick and treacherous. I was driving my old beat-up sedan along Route 47. My friend Ben was in the passenger seat, nervously tapping his foot. He hated driving in the rain, but we didn't have much of a choice. We were coming back from a small family gathering, hours away from home, and the weather had taken a sudden turn for the worse. The rain beat down on the windshield, and even with the wipers working overtime, I could barely see the road ahead. The headlights illuminated only a few feet in front of the car, casting eerie shadows on the wet asphalt. I kept my grip tight on the steering wheel, my knuckles white, trying to focus on keeping us on the road. Ben kept glancing out the window, but there wasn't much to see, just endless sheets of rain pouring from the sky. Out of nowhere, we heard a loud screech. It took me a second to realize that it wasn't coming from us. It was another car. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a pair of headlights speeding toward us. They were coming too fast. Before I could react, the car behind us swerved, trying to avoid us, but ended up clipping the back of our car. The impact sent us spinning out of control. I could feel the tires lose their grip on the road, and in a matter of seconds, we were sliding sideways. Everything felt like it was moving in slow motion. The car skidded toward the guardrail, and all I could do was hold on, bracing for the inevitable crash. The sound of metal crunching and glass shattering filled the air as we slammed into the guardrail, the front of the car crumpling like a tin can. My head whipped forward, and the seatbelt dug painfully into my chest. When we finally came to a stop, there was an eerie silence. The only sound was the rain pounding on the roof of the car and the faint hissing of steam rising from the wrecked engine. My heart was racing and my body was shaking. I turned to Ben, but he wasn't moving. Panic surged through me as I tried to unbuckle my seatbelt, my hands trembling. I called his name, hoping he was just dazed, but there was no response. I managed to unbuckle myself and turn toward him again. His head was slumped to the side, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. I reached over and shook him gently, my voice shaky as I called his name again. This time he stirred, groaning in pain. Relief washed over me for a moment, but it quickly faded when I looked down at his legs. The front of the car had been crushed inward, and his right leg was pinned beneath the twisted metal. My stomach churned at the sight. I didn't know what to do. The rain was still coming down hard, and the visibility was almost zero. No one else was on the road, and there was no way I could move the wreckage by myself. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. Not surprising for this part of the highway. I tried to comfort Ben as best as I could, but he was in and out of consciousness, his face pale and sweaty. Time seemed to stretch on forever. I was scared, helpless, and completely alone in the middle of a storm with my friend barely hanging on. It felt like an eternity before I saw flashing lights through the rain. A car pulled up behind us, and two paramedics rushed over. They worked quickly, but I could see the grim expressions on their faces when they realized the extent of Ben's injury. His leg was too far gone, crushed beyond repair. I stood there in shock, watching as they cut him free and loaded him onto a stretcher. The realization that he was about to lose his leg hit me like a punch to the gut, but there was nothing I could do. The hospital later confirmed what I already knew. Ben's leg had to be amputated. The crash had shattered it completely, leaving no other option. I still think about that night sometimes, the rain, the darkness, and the sound of the crash replaying in my head. It was a night that changed everything in the blink of an eye. A reminder of how quickly things can go wrong. sound, no footsteps, no movement, just the distant hum of insects and the soft rustling of the leaves in the breeze. I know what I saw. It was the fall of 1999, a night that still lingers in my mind like a ghost that refuses to fade. The storm that night was wild, the kind that shakes the earth and makes the world feel like it's holding its breath. Rain poured down in furious torrents and the roads were slick, treacherous. I was driving my old, beaten-up sedan along Route 47 with my friend Ben sitting tensely beside me. He hated the rain, and his foot tapped nervously against the floor, as though his leg couldn't decide whether to run or stay still. But we didn't have a choice. We were hours from home, returning from a family gathering, and the weather had turned on us suddenly, like some dark omen. The rain battered the windshield, the wipers fighting a losing battle to clear the view. Even with them scraping back and forth at full speed, I could barely see a few feet in front of us. The headlights only managed to cast ghostly, wavering shadows onto the wet asphalt. Shadows that seemed to shift and move with the storm. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white as I focused on keeping the car steady. Ben kept glancing out his window, but there was nothing to see, only the relentless rain pouring from the dark sky. Then out of nowhere there was a loud, piercing screech. It took me a second to realize it wasn't us. It was another car. In the rearview mirror, I caught sight of headlights barreling towards us fast, too fast. Before I could react, the car behind us swerved sharply to avoid hitting us head-on, but instead clipped the back of our sedan. The impact sent us spinning wildly out of control. Everything slowed down, like we were trapped in a nightmare that refused to end. The tires lost their grip, and we slid sideways, hurtling toward the guardrail. In those terrifying seconds, all I could do was hold on, my heart pounding as I braced for the inevitable crash. The sound of crunching metal and shattering glass tore through the night as we collided with the guardrail, the front of the car folding in on itself like a tin can. My head snapped forward, and the seatbelt dug painfully into my chest. Finally, we came to a stop, and a heavy, eerie silence settled around us. All I could hear was the relentless rain pounding against the car roof, and the faint hiss of steam rising from the battered engine. My hands were shaking, my heart racing. I turned to Ben, praying he was all right, but he wasn't moving. A cold wave of panic washed over me as I tried to unbuckle my seatbelt, my hands trembling so badly it took a few tries. I called his name, my voice shaky and desperate, but there was no response. Somehow I managed to unbuckle myself and leaned over to check on him. His head was slumped to the side, blood trickling from a deep gash on his forehead. My stomach twisted at the sight. I shook him gently, calling his name again, my voice barely above a whisper. This time he stirred, groaning in pain. Relief flooded through me, but it vanished just as quickly when I looked down at his legs. The front of the car had been crushed inward, trapping his right leg beneath the twisted metal. I felt a wave of nausea as I took in the sight, the unnatural angle of his leg, the blood staining his jeans. I was frozen, not knowing what to do. The rain continued to beat down, and visibility was still close to zero. There was no one else on the road, no sign of help, and I knew there was no way I could free him by myself. I reached for my phone, but as I feared, there was no signal. Not out here, in this desolate stretch of highway. I tried to keep Ben awake, talking to him softly, telling him everything would be all right, even though my own voice shook with fear. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his face growing paler with each passing minute. The hours dragged on, stretching out like a nightmare without end. I was cold, wet, and utterly alone, trapped in the darkness with my friend slipping further away. It felt like an eternity before I saw the faint flashing lights cutting through the rain. Relief washed over me as a car pulled up behind us and two paramedics rushed toward us. They worked quickly, but I could see the grim expressions on their faces when they saw Ben's leg. It was crushed beyond repair. There was nothing they could do to save it. I stood there numb, watching as they carefully cut him free and loaded him onto a stretcher. The reality of what had happened hit me like a punch to the gut. Ben was going to lose his leg. Later at the hospital, the doctors confirmed what I already knew deep down. His leg had to be amputated. The crash had shattered it so completely that there was no other option. That night changed everything. The storm, the darkness, the sound of metal bending and glass breaking. It all replays in my mind, over and over, a haunting reminder of how quickly everything can slip away. The night I almost didn't come back home is something I'll never forget. I had just turned 16, and my family decided it was time I got some driving practice. Normally, we'd order Papa John's delivery, but that night, my mom suggested we pick it up ourselves, thinking it would be a good way for me to get more time behind the wheel. We even left early, and as if by some twist of fate, the pizza was ready ahead of schedule. So with the pizza steaming on the seat beside me, we headed home. Once we got back, I could still feel the thrill of being on the road, as if we had somehow escaped something. We were setting up for dinner, our minds on nothing but the warm meal waiting for us. But that peaceful moment was shattered by a rumbling sound, distant at first, but growing louder and more threatening by the second. Then, in the blink of an eye, a fiery red blur streaked past our window, so fast we could hardly register it. Before we could even react, there was a deafening crash, a sound that seemed to echo from every corner of the street, followed by the sickening screech of metal grinding against metal. We bolted to the window. Down the street, we saw it. A bright red sports car crushed into a parked minivan, both vehicles mangled, twisted almost beyond recognition. My mom, panic-stricken, ran out to check for survivors and call for help, leaving my brother and me inside. We stayed glued to the window, watching helplessly as people gathered, their faces pale with shock. It was then that the story started to unfold, in whispers among neighbors. Two parties had been going on that evening. One a family reunion at our neighbor's house, the other up the street at the house of the guy who owned that red sports car. Apparently, some stranger had crashed the party, someone no one knew, who had been slipping drugs and alcohol to guests, especially the car's owner. As everyone got more distracted, this man started making off with valuables, sneaking them out one by one until he made his boldest move yet. He stole the car. The thief tore down our street, only to catch the attention of the police, who had seen him speed by, breaking every limit in the book. The thief panicked and floored it, his escape turning into a reckless blur as he pushed the car to its limits. But he lost control, sending the car hurtling straight into the minivan, parked on the side of the street. There was something about that minivan that made the whole scene even more haunting. The owner, our neighbor's daughter, had been getting ready to leave. She had packed everything, all set to go, except her baby, who was still inside with her. Normally her baby was quiet, calm, but on this night, something made that baby scream, almost out of nowhere. She had stayed behind to calm her child, delaying her departure by just a few moments. That delay had saved their lives. Had that baby not cried, both mother and child would have been in the van at the very moment the red car came crashing into it. Thinking of how close it had been sent a chill down my spine. The lives that could have ended in an instant, all by chance, a few seconds here, a baby's cry there. As I stood there shaken, I realized something else. We too had left earlier than usual, and the pizza was ready ahead of schedule. If everything had been normal, I would have been on that road at the exact time that red car blazed by. I was only just learning to drive, and in that moment, I knew I wouldn't have had the skill to react to a car speeding out of control like that. The man who stole the car was still alive somehow, though his freedom was short-lived. He was arrested on the spot, taken away as people whispered, some in anger, others in horror, over the close call. Later, we learned he was charged with theft, reckless driving, and endangering lives. Insurance would cover the loss of the van, but no insurance could replace the sense of peace that had been shattered that night. As for me, the thought of what could have happened kept me awake, haunted by the what-ifs that lingered in every corner of my mind.